What's up guys, Belamy Prime here, and as of right now, we are on the home stretch towards the ArcheAge Unchained release. It's going to pop in less than 8 hours from when I'm recording this video, so there are quite a few people who are panicking about their weapon types and choices for pretty much every class, whether it's Mage, Archer, or Melee. So we're going to talk about that in today's video. We are going to primarily be focusing on weapon types in regards to Melee players and what they should choose, whether playing Swiftblade or non-Swiftblade Melee. But for those of you who are curious about what weapons you should be taking as an Archer or a Mage, specifically dual wield, we will be talking about that briefly towards the end of the video, so stick around for that. So straight off the bat, we're going to show you guys exactly which weapon types are in the game, and then we're going to show you guys what they do, just so you have an understanding of what you should be choosing for ArcheAge Unchained. Straight off the bat, we know that there are 3 different weapon types in the game. There are slashing, crushing, and piercing types. Slashing includes katanas, daggers, and nodachis. Crushing is axe and great axe. Piercing includes swords, great swords, short spears, and long spears. Yes, weapons such as staves, scepters, and clubs do count as crushing, but you don't want to be using them as a melee weapon anyway, so we're not going to be talking about them in this video. So what do these weapon types mean and why are they important? Well, every type in the game has a corresponding armor type that it does additional damage to. The chance for it to deal additional damage is 50%, so it does have to proc. So 50% of the time you'll deal an additional X amount of damage to specific armor types depending on the weapon type you're using. If we look in game, we can see by looking at a plate buff that plate receives an additional 15% damage from piercing weapons. It also receives an additional 20% from crushing weapons. If we look at leather, we can see that it receives an additional 15% damage from slashing type weapons. However, if we look at cloth, it seems to have no additional damage received from any weapon types. However, this is not actually the case. Cloth actually receives an additional 1.5 to 3% damage from piercing type weapons. So this means swords, great swords, short spears, and long spears. If you do not believe me that this is the case, I have tested it many times on stream for people who are watching me. And if you don't believe me yourself, just go ahead in game, hit someone in cloth, and pay close attention to your combat log, and you will in fact see that you are dealing additional thrust damage to said person in cloth if you're using a piercing type weapon. So yes, it does not display itself on the actual cloth buff like you would expect it to, but it is very much a mechanic in the game. It exists and you deal additional damage to cloth using piercing type weapons, which means that piercing type weapons are actually a lot better than what people seem to think they are. That's because at first glance, when people are looking at it, why would you choose a piercing type weapon to deal an additional 15% to plate when you could just have a crushing weapon which deals 20%? Obviously, this makes sense because why would it have less if there's no trade-off? So the real reason why piercing type weapons have 5% less damage to plate is because you're trading that for your 1.5 to 3% damage to cloth. So now that we understand which weapons do bonus damage to what armor types, how do we choose which weapon we want to play with? Well, we have to take into consideration the attack speed of different weapons. Some weapons have different base attack speeds, whether it's 0.8 base attack speed all the way up to a potential 1.2 base attack speed. Essentially, the easiest way to look at this is that a 1.0 attack speed weapon deals 100% damage and has a baseline attack speed of 1, and if you scale that up or down, say for example a dagger with 0.8 is going to deal 20% less damage overall, but it's going to attack 20% faster. Same goes for the other end of the spectrum. A short spear, for example, that has a 1.1 attack speed is going to do an overall 10% more damage with hits, but is going to attack 10% slower. That is the easiest way to interpret it, and that's all you really need to understand. Do you want to attack a bit slower and hit harder, or do you want to hit a bit faster, but have smaller hits in general? So choosing what weapon type really comes down to personal preference, because it really comes down to, as a player, would you prefer to deal additional damage to this armor type, and what attack speed is going to best suit you as a player? Would you rather be much faster, or would you rather hit a bit slower and hit a bit harder? So it really comes down to personal preference. The only weapon type and weapon that I would tell people to steer clear of is daggers. The damage they do just seems much too weak in my opinion, and the attack speed just really isn't worth the trade-off. You can get away with it, but I honestly don't think that daggers are even remotely usable, at least in my opinion. But with pretty much every other weapon and weapon type, you can make an argument as to how it's going to be good in this scenario and how it's going to suit you as a player, and you're going to make it work around your playstyle. Katanas and Nodachis are perfectly fine on Unchained. We can expect to see a lot of people in leather, whether it's DPS melees, archers, or mages who are going to be taking leather, which I think is going to be a very common occurrence. I also think that taking a crushing type weapon is going to be a pretty safe bet, especially on ArcheAge Unchained. Initially, like very early on, I had reasons to believe that there was going to be a lot of people in plate come ArcheAge Unchained launch because of how good, essentially, it is in the current meta with how Hiram works. But in my experience playing on the PTS, there was actually a lot less plate wearers than I was expecting. Maybe this is because, you know, they were expecting a lot of mages to be playing, which in fact was the case. So, you know, they were afraid that plate was going to be a poor decision. And although with Hiram you can really round out your magical defenses these days, and plate is perfectly fine, you're not going to get completely shredded by mages, I think a lot of people were kind of afraid to mess around with plate, despite how good it is and how common I thought it was going to be. But nevertheless, there will be quite a few plate players, I feel like, on Unchained, so taking a crushing or piercing type weapon to have extra damage against plate makes perfect sense, especially when considering that your other option is to have additional damage against leather, and generally as a melee you don't really need additional damage against leather. For the most part, 95% of leather wearers are going to be DPS melees, glass cannon archers, and glass cannon mages, at least on Unchained, so generally you won't need additional help against those players. Now, speaking about not needing additional damage against specific players, when people realize that short spear is my dual wield weapon of choice, they seem to think that, you know, why would you trade that extra 5% damage to plate for an additional 1.5 to 3% to cloth? And for the most part, people don't even understand that there is that additional damage to cloth, but even the ones that do understand that there is additional damage to cloth, they seem to think, you know, you don't need additional damage to cloth. Cloth people are super easy to kill. They're extremely squishy. And although in some cases this is true, when you're fighting like a glass cannon mage, you don't need additional damage against them. But there are a lot of exceptions to this, especially in the current meta of ArcheAge when we get to late game. Healers are actually some of the tankiest players that you'll have to take down as a melee, and having that additional damage is very, very useful, even if it is only 1.5 to 3%. On top of this, you will see a lot of raid breakers and cloth tanks, whether they're revenants or actual skull knights and night cloaks and things like that. A lot of them will be wearing cloth, whether that's just because they want to play in cloth or because they want to be taking 4 pieces of Anthelon. Whatever it is they decide they want to do, cloth raid breakers and cloth tanks, not to mention extremely tanky cloth healers, are very common in the late game of ArcheAge. On live servers on Legacy right now, cloth healers are some of the tankiest players for you to take down. Most of them are running around with 40k HP or more. They have amazing healing output, so if you don't insta-kill them, they're able to instantly heal back to full HP, and they have all the mitigations to protect themselves, even from a really geared melee. So how are you going to choose which weapon type to run in ArcheAge Unchained? Well, like I said earlier, it really comes down to personal preference. Which types of armor would you prefer as a player to be able to deal extra damage to? Which ones do you think you're going to struggle against more and need to give yourself an edge against? And this video, I basically just kind of wanted to lay all the details out on the table for you guys, especially the entire piercing does extra damage to cloth situation, so that you guys could make an informed decision yourself about what weapon type to take as a melee for ArcheAge Unchained. In saying that, however, I understand that a lot of people would be coming to this video so that I could tell them what the best weapon is for them to take for ArcheAge Unchained, and I'm here to tell you guys that, yes, I will tell you what my personal favorite is, but in ArcheAge, there is no best weapon. There is no best armor for your class. You can make almost any weapon type, almost any armor type work nowadays. There is no best in slot armor type. There is no best in slot weapon type. It really comes down to how you want to play yourself, and especially before ArcheAge Unchained, we don't really know exactly how many people on which server is going to have more plate. Like, we don't know if there's going to be more cloth people, or if there's going to be more leather, or what the situation's going to be. So you really have to put your feelers out and figure out which weapon type is going to best suit you as a player and be the most competitive on your server. Now, in saying that, I'm going to tell you guys and explain to you guys why short spears for one-hander and long spears for two-handers are my personal favorite and in my opinion, the best weapon of choice for melees in ArcheAge. Now we're going to start off by comparing a long spear and a short spear to a katana and a nodachi, which are the slashing equivalents. Yes, the slashing equivalents deal an additional 15, or have a chance to deal an additional 15% to leather, and if you take a short spear or a long spear, you don't have that. However, using a long spear or a short spear, you have an additional 10% damage overall, because the attack speeds on said weapons are 0.1 higher in both cases. A nodachi is a 1.1 attack speed, whereas a long spear is a 1.2, and a katana is a 1.0, where a short spear is a 1.1. So overall, those weapons deal 10% more damage, and compared to a chance to deal 15%, your damage is higher. Yes, you attack a bit slower in both cases, but in my opinion, that is a worth trade-off. So yes, you don't get additional damage to leather, where when you would have a slashing weapon, but you have 10% more damage as a whole, and in my opinion, that's much more valuable. So that's my reasoning for choosing short spears or long spears over katanas or nodachis. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, why would I choose a short spear or a long spear over an axe or a great axe? You deal an additional 5% with an axe or a great axe to people in plate, so, at first glance, they might be more valuable. And they also have the exact same attack speeds. Now, this is in fact the case. Great axes and axes are very great weapons, in my opinion. I have no issues with them. I just personally prefer to have an additional extra little bit of damage to cloth instead of the extra 5% to plate. A lot of people would argue that the 5% to plate is more valuable. I'm not going to disagree with that. I think it's perfectly fine. I just prefer to have it a little bit against cloth when I need that. And on top of that, I personally think that long spears and short spears look better than axes and great axes. So that's another little reason why I prefer the short spears, long spears over axes and great axes. And of course, the last weapons that we can compare short spears and long spears to are swords and great swords. They're the exact same weapon type, but swords and great swords have a 0.1 faster base attack speed. So you basically just have to decide, okay, do I want to have a faster or a slower weapon? In my experience, having the slower weapon is more valuable, because late game, when you can round out your attack speed with actual attack speed stats in your gems, in your instrument, and your undergarments, as well as rings and things like that, it just generally increases your damage, and it feels perfectly fine when you have that attack speed. And it's even better again if you're taking 3 pieces of library or whatever it is you take to get even more attack speed to make those slower weapons feel much better. So I've given you guys all of the information and all of my arguments for you to be able to make a well-informed decision yourself for the server that you're going to be playing on. Like I said, with the exception of daggers being, in my opinion, a bit too weak, you can make an argument for really any other weapon type. Nodachis and katanas, while I kind of ragged on them a little bit when comparing them to short spears and long spears, they're really fast weapons and they're very, very good. I actually, Nodachi is my personal long-time favorite weapon, although I do think short spears and long spears are just better at the moment. I really do love Nodachis, and I think they're great-looking weapons and great weapons in general. The same goes for great swords, axes, and great axes. You can make an argument for each and every one of them. They're all great, and you're not really going to have any problems using any of those weapons in any scenario. Like I said, it really just comes down to personal preference, and I feel like I've given you guys the information that you need to make an informed decision yourself. Now, I promised that I'd talk about mages and archers and what weapons you should consider taking. First, we'll talk about mages. It's really a no-brainer with mages. You have to take either a staff or a scepter for your main hand weapons, because they're the only weapons in the game that give magic attack. But when it comes to dual wield, your offhand, people generally seem to think that you have to take daggers because they're the fastest weapon and you need the attack speed from that, when in fact the offhand contributes nothing in terms of attack speed, or doesn't affect your, mage situation whatsoever. It's purely a stat stick where the stats from your Lunafrost, your gems, and your synthesis effects are the only things affecting your damage. So you can have whatever offhand you want. Just pick something based on aesthetic. You can have katanas, daggers, swords, or axes. They can all go in the offhand slot, and all of them are the exact same in terms of stats. Now, for archers, on the other hand, it's a little bit more complicated. However, when it comes to the offhand for archers, it is the exact same situation for mages, whereas the offhand is purely a stat stick. The only stats you get from it are the Lunafrost, the gems, and the synthesis effects, and the weapon type doesn't matter whatsoever as an archer. So again, pick purely based on aesthetic. Whatever one you think looks the best, go with that. Now, when it comes to your main hand as an archer, there are a few options. You can use a club in your main hand, which opens the door to being able to do like weird hybrid archer classes, maybe for PvE or whatever it is you want to do for solo farming dungeons. Being able to self-heal can be useful at times, but it's not really necessary, especially when you're pretty much always going to be playing Ebonsong or Primeval or maybe Trickster or whatever archer class you're going to be playing. You're not really going to be playing any kind of hybrid archer healer class in PvP. At least I hope you're not. And on the other spectrum, you can take a scepter as your main hand. And the reason why people do this, you'll notice a lot of people in Korea have scepters in their main hand. For the most part, the reason they did this and the reason why a lot of people switched to scepters is because for a short while there, your poison scaled very heavily off magic damage, so it was very broken, and a lot of those players still have scepters from when that was the case, because they have no reason to change. Yes, your magic damage does still scale the damage of your poison weapons very slightly, but in my opinion, it's pretty insignificant and absolutely not necessary. But if you're interested in min-maxing your damage and getting a little bit of extra damage off of your poison weapons, then that is an option for you. You can take a scepter for your main hand. Now, the last main hand option that you guys should consider is having a dagger in your main hand for the attack speed. Now, this doesn't affect the attack speed of your archery skills in the slightest. The base attack speed of the weapon doesn't affect anything, but if you're interested in experimenting with Swiftblade archer builds where you use the mobility skills from Swiftblade in your archer build, some of those abilities that you might use will work faster with higher attack speed, so having a dagger makes sense, especially considering you don't actually care about the melee damage, so having the fastest weapon is going to be the best for you. So those are your three options: club for off healing, scepter for a bit of extra damage from poison weapons, or a dagger if you're planning on messing around with classes that use Swiftblade. It'll give you a bit of extra attack speed, but generally in terms of your actual archer abilities, the attack speed doesn't affect anything. So if you're not interested in playing that, your main hand weapon really doesn't matter. You could use a sword, you could use an axe. It's really not going to affect your archer damage very much at all. So you can be happy with whatever you end up choosing. But those are your options for the three different scenarios. So I hope you guys can make a well-informed decision on your own about what you go in that regard. But anyway, guys, I wish you the best of luck in ArcheAge Unchained. It should be a very amazing release of this beautiful game that we call ArcheAge. I'm very excited for it, and I will see you guys all on stream tonight when I go live for the ArcheAge Unchained release. I'd like to send a special shout out to all of my Patreon supporters: Jack from All Trades, Azriella, Lustest, Tonberry, Kronos, Adam B, and Tyler. I appreciate all of your support, guys, as well as everyone over on Twitch, and just the general support from you guys and encouragement. So it means a lot, guys. I appreciate it. If you like this video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys on ArcheAge Unchained. Cheers.